Phil Collins did not write In the Air Tonight in triumph. He did not write it as a celebration. He wrote it like a man standing in the ruins of a life he thought would last forever. And that may be the part so many people missed. The song sounded mysterious. It sounded angry. It sounded cold. But underneath it, there was something even more unsettling. It sounded like a man trying to breathe through heartbreak without letting the whole world hear him break. By the time the world heard those first dark notes, Phil Collins was already carrying a silence most people around him could not fully understand. He was famous, yes, respected, yes, surrounded by music, by schedules, by expectations, by the machinery of success. But private pain has a way of making even the busiest life feel empty. A crowded room can still feel like abandonment. A successful career can still feel like a door closing somewhere in the dark. And that is where this story begins. Not with the hit record, not with the drum fill, not with the radio success that would turn the song into something almost mythic. It begins in the quiet after something has already gone wrong. Because sometimes the most unforgettable songs are not born when life is rising. They are born when a man is sitting in the ashes, staring at what is left. Phil Collins had already known pressure. He had already known the strange split life that comes with success. One part of you belongs to the public, the other part keeps trying to survive in private. But when his marriage began to fall apart, all of that changed. The stage was still there. The applause was still there. The career was still moving. But home no longer felt like home. And for a man whose emotional honesty would eventually define so much of his music, that kind of fracture was not something he could simply fold up and hide away. It is easy looking back now to hear In the Air Tonight as a song made of mystery. People invented stories around it for years. They heard menace, they heard revenge, they heard some dark secret buried in the lyrics. But maybe the real secret was simpler, sadder, and more human than all of that. Maybe what people were really hearing was the sound of emotional shock, the sound of a man who could not yet explain what had happened to him, so he turned the feeling into atmosphere instead of confession. And that is what makes the song linger even now. It does not tell you everything. It does not give you neat answers. It gives you a feeling, a pressure, a heaviness, a storm gathering somewhere just out of sight. And the reason it feels so real may be because, in a way, it was. Imagine Phil Collins at that time, not as the global star people would later picture, not as the man attached forever to one of the most famous drum moments in modern music. Imagine him alone, a room late at night, maybe a lamp on, maybe no lamp at all, maybe only the soft glow of recording equipment, cigarette smoke, a glass left half-finished, papers scattered, thoughts he does not know how to organize. He is not trying to make history. He is trying to make sense of pain. There are moments in life when anger is easier than sorrow. Anger gives shape to hurt. It gives motion to grief. It lets a wounded person feel strong for a moment, even if the strength is trembling. In the Air Tonight feels like that kind of moment. Not rage in a loud, wild sense. Something colder than that. More contained. More dangerous. The kind of emotion that sits very still for a long time before it finally speaks. And still, that was only part of it. Because heartbreak is not just fury. It is confusion. It is humiliation. It is memory. It is waking up and realizing that the life you thought you were building now feels like a house with the lights turned off. It is hearing everyday sounds in an empty way. A hallway, a kettle, a car pulling away, a door closing. Small things become enormous when the heart has been cracked open. Phil Collins was a musician, but he was also a man who felt things deeply. that matters here. Some artists hide behind style, some hide behind performance, some dress pain up until it no longer resembles truth. But Phil Collins had a way of letting emotion come through in a rawer form. Even when he was not saying everything directly, you could hear the wound. You could hear the bruise beneath the words. And with In the Air Tonight, what he gave listeners was not a polished explanation. It was the emotional weather of a collapse. That is why the song begins the way it does. It does not rush. It waits. It hovers. It lets the tension build like a thought a man has been avoiding all day. It feels like midnight in emotional form. And that choice was no accident, even if he never sat down and spelled it out that way. A song like that could only come from someone living inside uncertainty, someone who had been wounded enough to know that the real damage does not always announce itself with shouting. Sometimes it comes in the hush afterward. People sometimes forget how lonely success can be. Fame creates distance. It surrounds you with people, yet it can make honest closeness harder to find. When private pain enters that world, it grows stranger. You are expected to keep moving, to show up, to perform, to be professional, to remain recognizable. But inside, something has shifted, and Phil Collins seems to have understood that split better than most. The public man kept working. The private man started pouring the truth into music. That is where the song's power deepens, because In the Air Tonight is not simply about one event, one argument, one betrayal, one memory. It feels bigger than that. It feels like the emotional aftermath of realizing that love, trust, and stability can disappear while the rest of life keeps going as if nothing has changed. That is a terrifying discovery, especially for a man who still has to get up the next morning and pretend he is fine. And perhaps that is why listeners connected to it so fiercely. Even those who never knew the details could feel the honesty in it. They heard a man holding something back because he had not yet found a language large enough for the pain. They heard accusation without clarity, loss without pleading, hurt without self-pity. It was dignified, but it was bleeding. Then comes the moment the whole world remembers. That explosion, that release, the drum fill that seemed to crack the song open from the inside. But maybe that moment matters so much because it is not just musical. Maybe it is emotional. It is the sound of pressure finally breaking. It is the sound of what happens when a man can no longer keep everything buried beneath the surface. By then, the song is no longer only a mood. It is a confession without details, a confrontation without names, a breakdown turned into rhythm, and that is why it does not fade. Plenty of songs are catchy. Plenty of songs are dramatic. But very few feel like a private wound, suddenly becoming public thunder. Still, the deeper story may be this. In the Air Tonight was not just about what Phil Collins had lost. It was about what he was becoming in the middle of that loss. Pain changes a person. It strips away certain illusions. It teaches harsh lessons about people, about memory, about yourself. The man who entered heartbreak is never quite the same as the man who comes out the other side. And in that song, you can hear someone crossing that line. What makes it even more haunting is that he did not turn away from the pain. He used it. He shaped it. He let it speak. That is not easy. Many people live through heartbreak and go silent. Others go numb. Some become bitter. Some become performative. But turning pain into something that millions of strangers can feel years later, that is different. That is alchemy of a very lonely kind. And there is another layer people often miss. When a song becomes iconic, it can trap the person who made it. The public takes ownership. The legend grows, the myths multiply, the story gets repeated until it hardens into something simpler than the truth. In the Air Tonight became one of those songs. People turned it into rumor, into urban legend, into a puzzle to solve. But the man who created it may have been doing something much more intimate than people realized. He may simply have been surviving. That makes the song sadder and in some ways greater, because behind every famous performance, behind every sold-out show, behind every moment where a crowd sang those words back to him, there must have been a private echo, a memory of where the song really came from. Not from mystery, not from myth, but from a chapter of life where the ground had shifted beneath him and music became the only place left where he could tell the truth without fully explaining himself. Years later, people would look at Phil Collins through many lenses: the star, the hitmaker, the voice, the drummer, the Genesis frontman, the solo giant, the man whose songs were everywhere. But songs like this remind us that before all those labels, he was something more fragile and more familiar. He was a human being trying to live through disappointment without letting it destroy him. And maybe that is why older listeners especially feel something in this song that younger ears sometimes miss. Because with age comes recognition. You hear the exhaustion in it. You hear the pride trying to stay intact. You hear the hurt that has moved past tears and into something quieter, heavier, more permanent. You understand that not every broken heart cries out loud. Some sit in the dark and write songs no one will ever fully decode. That is the hidden force behind In the Air Tonight. Not just heartbreak, but controlled heartbreak. Not just sorrow, but sorrow held in a clenched jaw. Not just betrayal, but the dignity of not naming every detail. It is the sound of a man refusing to beg, refusing to collapse in public, refusing to say more than he can bear to say, and somehow saying everything anyway. And the irony is almost painful. The song that made millions of people feel powerful may have been born from one of the most vulnerable periods of Phil Collins' life. The song that sounds so strong may have come from a place where he felt anything but strong. That is often how the most lasting art is made. Not from certainty, from fracture, not from control, from the desperate attempt to regain it. So when those first notes begin and the room seems to darken just a little and the voice enters like a man speaking from some private corner of memory, what you may really be hearing is not a mystery to solve. You may be hearing the emotional imprint of a life coming apart and a soul trying to put itself back together, one line at a time. And when the drums finally arrive, maybe they are not announcing revenge. Maybe they are announcing survival. That may be the truest hidden story of all. Because Phil Collins did not just write a song people would remember, he turned private wreckage into something timeless. He took the silence after heartbreak and gave it pulse. He took confusion and gave it shape. He took the ache of a broken home, a broken trust, a broken version of the future, and made it echo through speakers all over the world. That is why the song still feels alive. Because pain that honest does not age out. It does not become irrelevant. It waits inside the music year after year until another listener comes along with their own regrets, their own losses, their own midnight memories. And then suddenly it is not just Phil Collins's song anymore. It becomes theirs too. Maybe that is the final haunting truth behind In the Air Tonight. The inspiration was not some sensational secret. It was something older, deeper, and far more universal. A man watching love fall apart. A man trying not to fall apart with it. A man too proud to beg, too hurt to forget, and too gifted not to turn that wound into sound. And once he did, the whole world could feel it, even if they never knew exactly why.